Tonight I'm preaching with a stool. Just going to make sure. I know, right? It's very cool. So I've found that this service has me standing quite a lot more than the other services. So I'm doing something a little bit Pentecostal. I'm going to sit while I preach. I mentioned earlier this morning, yes, I did earlier this morning, but earlier today that we are meeting actually on Palm Sunday in the main church's calendar. And I thought to myself, I promise this series isn't just about me showing you pictures of when I was in the Holy Land. But this photo I took, which is actually the road into Jerusalem that Jesus took. And I was with a tour group. And there's a guy there you can see with the backpack. His name was Jack. And in Dubai Airport, as I mentioned, it was a Roman Catholic tour group because I didn't want to go to Jerusalem by myself. I do a lot of travel by myself. The Middle East, didn't really want to do that. And Jack came up to me and he goes, "Hello." And I said, "Hello." And he goes, "What's your name?" I said, "Kim." "What's your name?" And he goes, "I'm Jack." And he goes, "Oh, what do you do?" And I was a school teacher at that time. And I said, "Oh, I'm a teacher." And I said, "Oh, what are you doing?" And he said, "I'm training to be a Roman Catholic priest." And I went, "Oh, well." That was the end of that. It was such a great story. I used to tell it when I was at St. Peter's, East Maitland, and people go, that Roman Catholic clergy cannot marry. So I was trying to maybe make him be an Anglican, but that didn't happen. But that's okay. That was the road that Jesus took as he entered Jerusalem. And I thought I might just chuck that in, but the actual one I wanted to show you was this, because this is where, in 2018, I turned 30, so I'll tell you how old I am, and I treated myself to this pilgrimage in the Holy Land, and it was a time where there was peace, a bit more in the Holy Land, and this is a place called Mount Nebo. Now see, the thing is, Mount Nebo is a holy site for us as Christians, and I think it actually says there, Christian holy place. This is where Moses climbed up the mountain and he saw the promised land, which was the promised land of Canaan. It was the land that he could see, but he couldn't enter it. The area in the Middle East, which is Jordan and Jerusalem, are settings for our sermon series this year on the Ten Commandments. And tonight we heard a passage from Exodus that has caused so many issues in the historical church and has been responsible for all sorts of destroyed churches and some interesting beliefs in some Christian denominations. But I thought we might talk about, as I mentioned, this is where Moses saw the Holy Land, but he wasn't allowed to enter it. It was after he'd received the Ten Commandments. And I was like, this is the setting that we have, the desert of Jordan, the desert of this vast wilderness where these people have been released from their slavery in Egypt and come to the promised land. But before they did that, they were given commandments. And we saw the second one tonight, which was, you shall not make an image of anything in heaven or in earth, and you won't bow down to them. So let's have a look at this before we get started. Now, everybody who's been in the church for a while will recognize our cross here. This is called a San Damiano cross, which I believe was donated to the church, right, by Piriel? Yeah, and it's beautiful. I love it. Have you?
During the story.
Yeah.
This is a story.
How lovely. That's so good. There you go. God's talking to both of us in that way. So if you don't know, or maybe you've seen this, if you've been over to the main church, you might have seen this before. But if you haven't, it's called the San Damiano cross. And it's a cross that a guy called Francis of Assisi, or St. Francis of Assisi, was praying in front of one day. And you might have heard of St. Francis. He's the guy who really loves animals. He's the one we do St. Francis's Day. And he did certainly love all creation. And he also really, really, really loved Jesus. But Francis was praying in front of this cross when he heard God speak to him. And God gave him a commandment, actually, to rebuild the church, the actual building. My question for us, friends, does this image we have here and we have in our church, does it break the second commandment? For a long time, I used to think that, yeah, maybe it did. Maybe we can't have this holy art. Because this is a picture of Jesus, and there's a picture of all the apostles and some of the women and angels and all sorts of things are on the San Damiano cross. That's what makes it so beautiful, because it's got a lot of images on it. But does this break the second commandment? Because it's all about images, right? So it's a question that's puzzled Christians for a long time. But before we dive into that question, let's take a look at the context, because remember, from anytime we're talking about scripture, we're talking about context. We remember that these commandments were given to a people after they've been freed from slavery in Egypt. They are people who do not know how to live with one another or anybody in that matter. They've been living their lives year after year after year in slavery. I mean, it's this whole thing of being, if you were born to an Israelite family in Egypt, you were born a slave. And it's the bad slavery, because there's two types of slavery as well. But this particular type of slavery is the one where you are just completely not free. And it's been a battle for them of the strongest, might makes right type thing. If you're the strongest, then you're the best. So then you free a bunch of people. They reckon it's about 500,000 who have lived their whole lives, generation after generation, in slavery. How are you meant to teach them how to live, how to survive, and importantly, how to trust God, if you're God? Well, God's devised a way to do this, and he gave the people the 10 commandments, but actually he also gave them 619 commandments, but they're found scattered throughout the 5 books of the Old Testament, the first 5 during the desert wanderings. But the first lot are the ones we're talking about in our sermon series this year. The intact form, the 10 commandments, so sometimes call it the Decalogue, which just is Greek for 10 of them, deca. So we're looking at these commandments. Now, last month we spoke about God's first commandment, which was to avoid idolatry, which is not to worship things or people or other gods or anything that gets in the way of our relationship with worshipping the one true God. That's what idolatry is. This week we see a commandment to not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or in the earth beneath or in the waters under the earth. Now, on that surface, it feels like anything we have in our homes, knickknacks, that kind of thing, is technically breaking the second commandment. If God says don't make an image of anything that is in heaven on earth, are all our knickknacks sinful? We have to go home and put them all in the bin. Well, if you don't want to dust, you can, but we will talk more about that in just a sec. Friends, the original, the Hebrew word for image is this word pesel. And you can see maybe, on that slide, it actually references a verse in Matthew's Gospel, which is Matthew 22, and it shows us where, in another place, this same word is used. I think it's on this. Oh, it is, wonderful. I was like, did I put that in the slide? I can't remember. Matthew 22, Jesus asked them, whose image is this? And whose inscription? He's looking at a coin when he's talking about it. Caesar's, they replied. And he said to them, so give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. So the thing about the people who exited Egypt in the book of Exodus, friends, their religion was really, really different. And actually, it's a feature of the Hebrew faith is that there is no image of God. But everywhere else in this area at the same time, when Israel was around, were worshipping gods that were carved, made out of stone, made out of brass, or whatever. And here comes along this God, the true God, who has no physical form, until he is later what we see incarnate in the person of Jesus. And that's why Jesus is talking about this, about Caesar. He's saying, that's Caesar's coin, right? So you can put his head on it, that's fine, because that doesn't matter to me. In God's kingdom, it's about worship and love and trust. Give that to Caesar, that's fine. So that's why Jesus is using this same image to say, look, it's not quite what you think it is, this word image. The commandment not to make images of things is to prevent these Israelites from becoming like the people around them, because the second commandment is designed to set them apart from the people around them. They are supposed to be different. And we are supposed to be different even today. And as I mentioned, that's why Jesus is talking about in a poetic way to say that the material world, sure, that can belong to kings and princes and to the world, but the heavenly things, the things that are worth far more, you can't make images of them, because how can you? They're so profound. It brings us now to that second chunk of the commandment, which says, you shall not bow down to them or worship them. And this is the meaty part of the commandment, friends. It's the one that says making images of things in nature or images of other gods and worshipping them is actually the sin. So even this image here, our San Damiano cross, if we were to worship this, it's wood, right? and give this the glory, that would be the sin. We're not meant to worship the wood. However, this image points our eyes and our hearts towards the living God, towards God. It's an image of Jesus, but we wouldn't, come up to this and say, this is Jesus, because it's not. It's wood. Yeah, this isn't Jesus. This is an image of him, and we don't worship of them. Worship Jesus, not the wood. And our San Damiano cross is actually what we call an icon. You might have heard the word icon before. Icons are religious art, and their purpose is not to be worshipped. As I mentioned, we've got our San Damiano cross, but we don't worship it. It just helps us picture Jesus or picture God, to have our hearts lifted to these holy places. See, the example we had a few weeks ago in the main church, we had Moses lifting up the bronze serpent in the desert, and all of the people who were being bitten by snakes had to look at the bronze serpent to live, and that tells us that the image itself isn't forbidden, but rather its improper use is forbidden. So the commandment forbids us creating and worshipping images of false gods as well. See, Christ is the true God. That's the other thing too. Christ is the true God, so we can have images of him that help us worship him as well. See, before the invisible and limitless God of Israel became incarnate, that just means he became Jesus, became the Son, it was impossible to make an image of him. But after God assumed this visible and tangible human body, we can now see this invisible God, and we can create this holy art that helps us to picture or visualize what it may have been like to have lived with Jesus. Now, for nearly 1,000 years, icons weren't even a problem in the church. People just went, yeah, cool, we're going to make some icons, that's okay. And then we sort of had a movement in the church called the Reformation. And during that time, something called iconoclasm was popular. And it was around a bit before that time, but it got really big in the Reformation. People went around and destroyed icons in churches. When I was in Canterbury Cathedral, they showed us the sort of bottom windows were all clear glass. But they said many years ago these would have been ornate stained glass windows. But these people who had reread the Bible and thought, we've got to take it super, super, super literally, which means no images of anything. So that's why there's a lot of clear glass, because they came in and smashed all the beautiful stained glass. And I went, oh my God, my heart broke. Now in the Anglican Church, we have no problem with icons. We have no problem with stained glass, because we've got plenty of it over in the church, plenty of stained glass in our church. We also have plenty of plain windows in our church too. There are degrees of being okay with it. Not every church in the Anglican tradition will have the San Damiano cross, but that doesn't mean it's not okay, if that makes sense. Not everybody has it, but there's degrees of being okay with them, but they're not idols, is the point. Now, at the end of our commandment, we've got this hard part that says, I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and the fourth generation of them who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. Ooh, imagine walking into church for the first time and going, oh my God, what kind of God is this you want me to follow, Reverend Kim? He sounds super vindictive. If you were reading that for the first time, you're like, oh my God, am I going to follow this God? The reason we balk at that, or I certainly do, is we're reading this passage with our 2024 glasses on, our 2024 hearts, our 2024 language. See, the thing is, God is dealing with a people who, I said before, have been in slavery for 400 years. He's made an agreement with them, which we call a covenant. And what God is actually saying is actually really reassuring to the Israelites. Because if God is saying he is so fully committed to the covenant, then this covenant will only mean something if God is fully invested. And people are messy. You know, have you noticed that we're messy? And I don't mean my house, because it's messy too, but I mean emotionally and spiritually. Certainly physically messy, but emotionally and spiritually, we're often really messy. Sometimes we're all into God, sometimes we're not, sometimes we're angry, sometimes we're sad. God is saying here that even in our messiness, he won't break his promise. And that's what's actually going on there. See, in English, the word jealous is a horrible word. You don't want to be jealous in English, right? But in Hebrew, it isn't exactly how this is written. See, oh, that was meant to be the other sermon point. Sorry, but this is actually what I wanted to say. The Hebrew word for jealous is actually a positive word. And it's a bit like a marriage covenant. So once you get married, you are together to the exclusion of all others. And that's a bit like what this Hebrew word jealousy is saying. You're mine, not anybody else's, you're mine. And it's this really deep love word. It's just translated jealous for us. It's God guarding his own deeply with deep and perfect love. All right, with all that said, a little bit of a history lesson, a bit of an icon lesson. What does it mean for us today, living in Dungog as Christians here? Well, it's a timely issue, friends. Idolatry is a challenge for our faith. Even atheism isn't really a challenge for us, because atheism is a bit of a fad. There's always been atheists. It goes up and down like this. It's actually idolatry that's the real challenge for us, putting other things and people and places and events or whatever on our heart first before God, where God should be, I should say. Like I've mentioned, friends, we are made to be set apart. We're made to be different. God sets us apart as Christians to follow his commands, to remove idolatry, enjoy the art, enjoy the windows that all point to him and his story. We are in a covenant with God, a sacred agreement. And if we follow his commands and we preach the gospel and love one another, I thought I might have got there before it did it. We follow his commands, we preach the gospel, and we love one another, we will be living according to God's will. Amen.
Amen.
So close.